They sat in the courtroom wearing Italian silk, looking like the dignified guardians of our family estate. But beneath the polished veneer, there was only greed. I'm Olivia Cole, and as I watched my parents smirk, I didn't see family. I saw the strangers who drank vintage wine while handing me an eviction notice in the pouring rain, willing to bulldoze my home for a check. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. They thought I was there to beg for mercy, but I was there to deliver justice. There is a specific sound that sandpaper makes when it meets old varnish. It is a rough, scratching hiss, a sound of friction, a sound of work. For the last 3 years, that sound has been the soundtrack of my life. My hands are rarely clean. There is usually a smudge of charcoal on my cheek or the scent of linseed oil clinging to my cardigan. I don't mind it. In fact, I prefer it. It is the smell of preservation. My name is Olivia Cole. I am 29 years old, though my father likes to say I was born middle-aged. He might be right. I have never cared much for loud music or crowded rooms. I care about paper. I care about ink. I care about the stories that families try to bury and the ones they try to rewrite. I am a genealogist. I trace bloodlines for a living. I find the truth in the dusty corners of county archives. But my most important project wasn't a client's family tree. It was my home. I live in the carriage house behind Blackwood Hall. When I moved in, it was little more than a shed for rusted garden tools and spider webs. The roof leaked. The floorboards were rotted through. My parents, Robert and Eleanor, laughed when I asked to live there. They told me it was a folly. They told me I would be back in the main house within a week, begging for central heating. I didn't beg. I worked. I stripped the floors myself. I reglazed the windows. I learned how to mix mortar and how to hang drywall. Bit by bit, I turned that ruin into a sanctuary. It is small, yes. It has a tiny kitchen with a copper kettle that whistles when the water boils, and a reading chair by the fire that fits me perfectly. It is warm. It is mine. Or at least I thought it was. Blackwood Hall, the great mansion that casts its long shadow over my roof, is a different story. It is a beast of a house. Built in 1902, it has stone gargoyles and 20 bedrooms that no one sleeps in. It is cold. It smells of damp wool and fading potpourri. My parents live there like ghosts in a museum. They are what people around here call land rich and cash poor. They have a $50 million name, but they struggle to pay the heating bill. To them, the estate isn't a heritage to be protected. It is an albatross around their necks. A burden, a piggy bank they were just waiting to smash open. I should have seen it coming. But betrayal is rarely loud. It is usually quiet, signed with a pen and delivered by a stranger. It happened 3 weeks ago. The weather was dreadful. A late autumn storm was battering the coast, and the rain was hitting my windows like handfuls of gravel. The wind howled through the eaves of the carriage house, but inside I was safe. I had a fire crackling. I had tea. Then there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was sharp, authoritative. 3 hard raps. I opened the door to find a man standing there, water dripping from the brim of a cheap hat. He didn't look me in the eye. He just reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope wrapped in plastic. "Olivia Cole?" he asked. "Yes." "You've been served." He turned and walked back to his car before I could even ask a question. I closed the door against the wind and tore open the plastic. It was an eviction notice. Notice to quit. You are hereby required to vacate the premises known as the Carriage House at Blackwood Estate within 30 days. My hands shook. I read it again, hoping the words would change. They didn't. The plaintiff listed at the top wasn't a bank. It wasn't the government. Plaintiffs Robert and Eleanor Cole. I didn't put on a coat. I ran out into the rain clutching the paper and sprinted across the cobblestone courtyard to the back door of the main house. I burst into the kitchen, dripping wet, my hair plastered to my face. The house was silent as always. I found them in the library. They were sitting by the unlit fireplace drinking a bottle of expensive red wine. My mother, Eleanor, looked up from her magazine. She didn't look shocked to see me. She looked bored. "You're dripping on the Persian rug, Olivia," she said. I slammed the papers down on the mahogany coffee table. "What is this?" My father, Robert, took a slow sip of his wine. He swirled the glass, watching the red liquid coat the sides. "It's legal documentation, Olivia. I would think, given your profession, you'd be familiar with reading documents." "You're evicting me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I restored that house. I poured my own money into it. You said I could live there." "We said you could live there," Robert corrected, "as long as we owned the land. But circumstances change." "We have an offer," my mother added, flipping a page of her magazine. "A very generous offer. $8.5 million. I froze. "You're selling the hall." "We are selling the land," Robert said, "to a developer from the city. He has a vision: luxury condominiums, modern, efficient living." "Condominiums?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "But the hall, the library, the gardens, what happens to them?" Robert sighed, as if explaining something simple to a slow child. "The developer needs a clean slate, Olivia. The hall is riddled with dry rot. The plumbing is ancient. It's not cost-effective to keep it." "He's going to demolish it," I whispered. The horror of it washed over me. "You're letting him bulldoze 100 years of history. Your history. For a check. For survival." My mother snapped, finally closing her magazine. "We are drowning in debt, Olivia. We are tired of being cold. We are tired of repairing roofs. We deserve a retirement. We deserve peace." "And what about me?" I asked. "What about my home?" "The carriage house isn't rotting. I fixed it." "It's on the parcel," Robert said, shrugging. "It goes too. The bulldozer doesn't discriminate." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a checkbook. "Look, we aren't heartless. When the sale closes, we'll give you something. $10,000. That should be enough for a deposit on a rental in the city. You can start over." $10,000. The price of my labor. The price of my dignity. I looked at them, really looked at them for the first time in years. I didn't see my parents. I saw two strangers who happened to share my last name. They were small, selfish people who would burn down a cathedral just to sell the ashes. "I won't leave," I said quietly. "Then the sheriff will remove you," Robert said, his voice hard. "Don't make this ugly, Olivia. It's done. That was 3 weeks ago. Today the rain has stopped. The sun is shining cold and bright. I stand in front of the mirror in my bedroom. I am not wearing my work clothes today. No charcoal smudges. No linseed oil. I am wearing a navy blue suit that I bought for funerals. It seems appropriate. I zip the skirt. I button the blazer. I put on my heels. The sound they make on the hardwood floor, click, 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 is steady. I am not packing boxes. I am not moving out. On the bed sits my leather satchel. It is old and battered, much like everything else I love. Inside there are no clothes. There is only a stack of papers. Very old, very fragile papers that smell of dust and time. My parents think I spent the last 3 weeks crying. They think I spent the time looking for apartments. They are wrong. I spent the last 3 weeks doing what I do best. I went to the archives. I went back to the beginning. I dug through the deeds and the trusts and the wills of the dead. I looked for the ghosts they tried to ignore. And I found one. I pick up the satchel. It is heavy, but the weight feels good. It feels like armor. My hands are trembling slightly, but my resolve is not. I am terrified of what I am about to do. I am about to walk into a courtroom and declare war on the people who gave me life. But they broke the covenant first. They chose the money. I take a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the home I built. I am the archivist. I am the keeper. And I am the only thing standing between Blackwood Hall and the wrecking ball. I open the door and step out into the light. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. To understand the weight of the satchel I am carrying today, you have to understand where it came from. It didn't come from a sleek modern office with glass walls and high-speed internet. It came from the basement of the county clerk's office. I was there 4 days ago. The archive room is a place time forgot. It is 3 stories underground, a concrete bunker filled with rows of metal shelving that stretch back into the darkness. The air down there is always the same temperature, 65 degrees and dry as a bone. It smells of dust, decaying cardboard, and the sharp metallic tang of old staples. The only sound is the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Bzzzt, a constant angry insect noise that drills into your skull if you stay too long. I stayed for 8 hours. I had gone there looking for a miracle. Or perhaps I was just looking for the truth. My parents claimed they had the right to sell Blackwood Hall. In legal terms, they claimed they held the title in fee simple. That is a lawyer's way of saying they own it outright. The land, the house, the trees, the dirt underneath, all of it theirs, to keep or sell or burn as they see fit. But I know my family history, and I know my great-grandmother Beatrice Blackwood. She was not a woman who believed in fee simple. She was a woman who believed in blood. She was the one who restored the hall after the Great War. She was the one who planted the oak trees that now line the driveway. She didn't trust banks, and she certainly didn't trust men who gambled. So I started pulling the files. I didn't start with the deed. I started with the debts. It is amazing what you can learn about people from public records. My parents walk around town with their heads held high, wearing cashmere and driving a vintage Jaguar. But down here in the cold light of the archives, the truth was ugly. I found a lien against the property from 2 years ago. Unpaid contractor fees for roof repairs that were never finished. I found another lien from the state. Back taxes. $12,000 in unpaid property taxes. My heart sank as I turned the pages. They weren't just selling the house because they were tired of it. They were selling it because they were drowning. They had been living on credit and appearances for a decade. The eviction notice they served me wasn't just cruelty. It was panic. They needed that $8 million to bury their mistakes. But then I found the box I was looking for. Blackwood Estate, 1920, 1930. I pulled the heavy cardboard box off the shelf. Dust motes danced in the flickering light. I sat down at one of the long wooden tables and opened it. Inside were bundles of letters, receipts for lumber, and at the very bottom, a thick document bound in blue ribbon that had turned gray with age. The original deed of transfer. I untied the ribbon. The paper was thick-textured parchment. The ink was brown, fading but legible. Great-grandmother Beatrice had beautiful handwriting, sharp, angular, and deliberate. I began to read. Most deeds are standard boilerplate. I hereby transfer X to Y for the sum of Z. But this was different. This was a narrative. I, Beatrice Blackwood. It read, being of sound mind and fierce heart, do hereby establish this trust for the preservation of the Blackwood lineage. I traced the words with my gloved finger. I read through the paragraphs describing the boundaries of the land, the water rights to the creek, the mineral rights, and then I stopped. My finger hovered over a paragraph near the end. Paragraph 14. It was a restriction. In property law, we call it a fee tail. It is an old, almost extinct concept. It limits who can inherit a property. Usually in the old days, it was used to keep property in the hands of the eldest son. But Beatrice Blackwood didn't have sons. She had daughters, and she had a husband who liked to spend her money on horses. I read the clause aloud to the empty room. My voice sounded small against the humming lights. To ensure the sanctuary of the bloodline and to protect the estate from the whims of transient fortune, this title shall bypass the male heir if he is married outside the county. I paused. My father, Robert, had married my mother in Paris. I continued reading. And the title shall settle immediately upon the firstborn daughter of the subsequent generation upon her 25th birthday. I read it again. And a third time. The buzzing of the lights seemed to fade away. The cold air in the room suddenly felt electric. My father, Robert, was the male heir. He had married outside the county. I was the firstborn daughter of the subsequent generation. I am 29 years old. The logic hit me like a physical blow. My parents didn't own Blackwood Hall. They never had. My father was just a steward, a caretaker holding the seat warm until I turned 25. For the last 4 years, while I was scrubbing floors and sanding beams in the carriage house, asking for their permission to paint a wall, I was the legal owner of the entire estate. They had been threatening to evict me from my own house. I sat back in the hard wooden chair. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Triumph, yes, but also a deep aching sadness. They didn't know. I was sure of it. They were greedy, yes, but they weren't stupid enough to try to sell a house they didn't own. They simply hadn't bothered to read the deed. They assumed with the arrogance of people who have always been given everything that the house was theirs by divine right. They had ignored the history. They had ignored the paperwork. And now, that ignorance was going to cost them everything. I carefully folded the document and placed it in my satchel. I turned off the light in the archive room. That was 4 days ago. Now I'm in the hallway of the probate court. The atmosphere here is very different from the archives. It is loud. It echoes. The floors are polished marble that amplifies every footstep. People are rushing past with briefcases and coffees, checking their watches, arguing on cell phones. I am standing near a pillar, waiting. I see them before they see me. Robert and Eleanor come out of the elevator. They look impeccable. My father is wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. My mother is in a cream-colored dress coat, her pearls glowing under the atrium lights. They look like the victims. That is their gift. They know how to look like the wounded nobility forced into a corner by a cruel world. They spot me. For a second, I see a flash of annoyance cross my mother's face. She smooths it over instantly, replacing it with a look of pity. They walk toward me. I don't move. I clutch the handle of my satchel tighter. Olivia, my father says. His voice is smooth deep, the voice he uses when he wants to charm a waiter or a banker. I didn't think you'd actually come. I was served a court date, I say. My voice is steady. I'm here. My mother steps closer. She smells of lavender and expensive hairspray. She reaches out as if to brush a piece of lint off my shoulder, but I step back. Her hand drops. Darling, she says, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. This is a formality. You know that, right? We don't want to do this in front of a judge. It's Unseemly. Then withdraw the sale, I say. Robert laughs, a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It's not that simple, Olivia. The contracts are signed. The deposit is paid. We can't just unring the bell. He looks around the hallway, making sure no one is listening. He steps into my personal space. Look, he says, we've been talking. Your mother and I. We know this is hard for you. You're attached to the carriage house. We get it. Attached, I repeat. I built it. Yes, yes. He waves his hand dismissively. Labor of love. We appreciate it. That's why we want to increase the offer. He pauses, waiting for me to look impressed. 12,000, he says. We'll give you $12,000 from the sale proceeds. Cash, tax-free. He says the number like he is handing me the crown jewels. $12,000. It is exactly the amount they owe in back taxes. The irony is almost funny. You're offering me $12,000, I say slowly, to walk away from my home, to let you bulldoze great-grandmother's library, to let them tear up the rose garden she planted in 1922. It's a generous offer, my mother hisses. Her mask of pity is slipping. You have no equity in the property, Olivia. You have no lease. You are a squatter. We are trying to be kind. Kind? I look at her. You're selling our heritage for condos. You're erasing us. We are saving ourselves, she snaps. Do you know what it costs to heat that mausoleum? Do you know what the insurance costs? We are drowning Olivia. And you are standing on the shore, judging us for trying to find a lifeboat. It's not a lifeboat, I say. It's a payout. You want the money so you can move to the city and pretend you're still rich. Stop being so sentimental, Eleanor says, rolling her eyes. It's embarrassing. It's just wood and stone, Olivia. It's rotten drafts. It's over. Yes, I say softly. It is over. They think I am agreeing with them. They think I am conceding. Robert smiles. It is a relieved, triumphant smile. He claps a hand on my shoulder. Good girl, he says. I knew you'd see reason. Now just go in there. Tell the judge you've reached an agreement with us and we can all go to lunch. I'll treat you, keeping it in the family. Yes, I say, keeping it in the family. I don't tell him about the satchel. I don't tell him about paragraph 14. I don't tell him that in about 10 minutes he is going to learn the true definition of the word steward. I'll see you inside, I say. I turn away from them before they can see the expression on my face. It isn't defeat. It is the cold, hard resolve of a Blackwood. I walk toward the heavy double doors of courtroom 4. The bailiff holds the door open for me. My parents follow a few steps behind, whispering to each other, confident that they have won. They are walking into a trap, and they are holding the shovel they dug it with. I step across the threshold. The courtroom is silent. It is time to testify. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The silence that followed the judge's ruling was heavy. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a library or a church. It was the suffocating silence of a room where the air has been sucked out. Mr. Sterling, the high-priced lawyer, was the first to move. He snapped his briefcase shut with a sharp click. He didn't look at my parents. He didn't offer them a consoling hand or a word of advice. He simply turned on his heel and walked out, his shoes squeaking on the linoleum. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one, and he had no intention of going down with the captain. I stood at the podium for a moment longer, my hand resting on the leather satchel. I looked at my parents. 10 minutes ago, they had been the titans of the county. They were the Coles of Blackwood Hall, people who commanded respect, or at least fear. Now they looked small They looked shrunken. Robert was staring at the table, his face a mask of gray ash. Eleanor was weeping but silently. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, careful not to smudge her mascara, even in the midst of ruin. I walked back to my table and began to gather my things. Olivia, my father said. His voice was a rasp. He didn't look up. I didn't answer. The deposit, he whispered. We spend the deposit. I paused. Excuse me. He looked up at me then. His eyes were wide-rimmed with red. The developer given us a $2 million advance to cover the debts, to pay off the liens. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. You spent $2 million before the sale was even closed. We had to, Eleanor cried out, her voice shrill. The creditors were calling every day. We were going to lose the Jaguar. We were going to lose the club membership. We had to maintain our position. I shook my head, slowly. It was staggering. They hadn't just tried to sell my heritage. They had gambled it away on appearances. You don't just lose the sale, I said, my voice low. You are in breach of contract. The developer will sue you for the $2 million back, plus damages. We don't have it, Robert said. He put his head in his hands. We don't have a dime. We are ruined. They sat there paralyzed by the weight of their own greed. They were waiting for me to fix it. That had always been the dynamic. They made the mess. I cleaned it up. I was the one who fixed the roof when they ignored the leak. I was the one who cataloged the library when they wanted to sell the books by the yard. But I couldn't fix this. And for the first time, I didn't want to. The surprise character. A tragic business. A voice croaked from the back of the room. Truly tragic, but entirely predictable. I turned around. My parents turned around. Standing in the rear of the courtroom, leaning heavily on a cane with a silver handle, was Mr. Abernathy. I hadn't seen him in years. He was the family's estate lawyer, a man who had served my grandfather. He was well into his 80s now, his suit ill-fitting on his skeletal frame, but his eyes were bright and sharp as a hawk's. He began to walk down the center aisle. Tap, step, tap, step. The sound of his cane was the only noise in the room. Abernathy, my father shouted. He stood up, pointing a trembling finger. This is your fault. Mr. Abernathy stopped. He looked at my father with a mixture of pity and disdain. My fault, Robert. You drew up the papers, Robert yelled. You handled the transfer when Dad died. Why didn't you fix this? Why didn't you break the trust? I am a lawyer, Robert, not a magician, Abernathy said calmly, and I am certainly not a thief. He reached the front of the courtroom and looked at me. He nodded a small gesture of respect. Ms. Cole, he said, you presented the case admirably. Thank you, Mr. Abernathy, I said. He turned back to my father. I warned you, Robert. Do you remember 10 years ago? In my office, I told you about paragraph 14. I told you that your title was limited. I told you that you were merely a steward. I told you to fix it, Robert sputtered. I told you to bury that old paper. I told you to make it go away. Yes, Abernathy said softly. You did. You told me to burn the deed. You said, and I quote, what Olivia doesn't know won't hurt her. My mother gasped. I felt a sharp pang in my chest. Hearing it confirmed was different than suspecting it. They had actively conspired to steal from me. I didn't bury it, Robert, Abernathy continued. I filed it because my sworn duty was to the estate, not to your gambling debts, not to your vanity, to the estate. He looked around the courtroom, his voice gaining strength. The Blackwood estate has stood for 100 years. It has survived storms, fires, and wars. It was not my place to let it fall because of one foolish generation. He looked back at me. The deed was always there waiting for the rightful owner to come looking for it. I am glad you finally did, Olivia. My father collapsed back into his chair. The fight had gone out of him. He realized finally that he had no allies. Even the old family retainer, the man he thought was his servant, had been loyal to the house, not the master. We walked out of the courtroom and into the bright, harsh fluorescent light of the hallway. The dynamic had shifted so completely that it felt like the gravity had changed. When we walked in this morning, my parents were leading the way, marching toward their payday. Now they trailed behind me like lost children. I stopped near the elevators. They stopped too, keeping a respectful distance. They looked terrified. For the first time in their lives, they were homeless. Technically, they were worse than homeless. They were trespassers. They had no money. They had massive debts. And the roof over their heads, the roof they had tried to tear down, now belonged to the daughter they had tried to evict. My mother looked at me, her eyes pleading. Olivia, where are we going to go? I don't know, Mother, I said. Where are you going to go? She flinched. We can't go to a hotel. Our cards are maxed out. That is a problem, I agreed. Olivia, please, my father said. His voice was broken. We are your parents. And I am your daughter, I said. The daughter you tried to throw into the street. The daughter you lied to for 10 years. We were desperate, he said. You have to understand. I understand desperation, I said. I felt it 3 weeks ago when I was standing in the rain reading an eviction notice. But I didn't try to cheat anyone. I didn't try to destroy history. I looked at them. They were pathetic, really. Stripped of their wealth, stripped of their arrogance. They were just two old people who had made a lifetime of bad choices. I could crush them. I had the power. I could tell them to leave the keys at the desk and never come back. I could let them face the developer and the lawsuits on their own. It would be justice. It would be exactly what they deserved. But as I looked at my father's trembling hands and my mother's ruined makeup, I remembered something. I remembered the house. Blackwood Hall. Great-grandmother Beatrice didn't build it to be a fortress. She built it to be a sanctuary. She wrote that deed to protect the family even from itself. If I threw them out, I would be doing exactly what they tried to do to me. I would be putting cruelty above family. I would be letting the bitterness win. I wasn't my father. I wasn't a steward of greed. I was a steward of something else. I sighed, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. Come on, I said. Let's go home. Mukju, don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. The walk from the courthouse doors to the parking lot felt like crossing a desert. The wind had picked up. It whipped around the pillars of the old building, tugging at my coat, stinging my cheeks. It was a cold wind, but it felt clean. It felt like the kind of wind that strips away the dead leaves to make room for the new. I walked a few paces ahead of my parents. I could hear their footsteps behind me, shuffling uncertain. For 30 years, their footsteps had been heavy with authority. Now they sounded like ghosts. I stopped at my car. It was an old station wagon, rusted around the wheel wells, filled with boxes of files and gardening tools. Next to it, parked in the spot reserved for VIP, was my father's vintage Jaguar. He stared at the Jaguar. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the keys. He looked at them for a long moment, his hand trembling, and then he looked at me. They'll take it, he whispered. The creditors, they'll take the car first. Yes, I said. They probably will. I unlocked my station wagon. Get in. The drive back to Blackwood Hall was silent. My mother sat in the passenger seat staring out the window at the passing telephone poles. My father sat in the back, slumped over, looking at his hands. As I drove, I felt a burning coal of anger in my chest. I thought about the eviction notice. I thought about the way they drank wine while telling me they were destroying my home. I thought about the 10 years of lies, the way they had smiled at me while secretly hoping I would never find out who I really was. I had the power now. The deed was in my satchel. The law was on my side. I could drive past the gates. I could stop at the end of the driveway and tell them to get out. I could tell them to walk to the nearest shelter. I could let them feel the cold rain on their faces just as I had. It would be justice, would be an eye for an eye, a home for a home. But then we turned the corner and I saw the house. Blackwood Hall rose above the trees, its stone turrets gray against the pale blue sky. It looked timeless. It looked indifferent to our petty human squabbles. It had sheltered 4 generations of Blackwoods. It had seen births and deaths, weddings and wars. It was built to endure, and it was built to protect. I pulled the car up the gravel driveway. The crunch of the tires was loud in the silence. I stopped in front of the main entrance, the massive oak double doors that I had polished so many times. I turned off the engine. The silence rushed back in. The act of mercy. "We're here," I said. My parents didn't move. They looked at the house as if it were a stranger. They knew as well as I did that they no longer belonged there. "Olivia," my mother said, her voice barely a whisper, "we have nowhere else." I took a deep breath. This was the moment, the pivot point between the past and the future. "Get out," I said. We stepped onto the gravel. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I walked up the stone steps to the front door. My father followed me, reaching automatically into his pocket for his house keys. "No," I said. He froze. I held out my hand. "Give me the keys." He looked at me, his eyes wide. He looked at the heavy brass key ring, the symbol of his status, his lordship, his identity. "Olivia," he started, "you are not the owner, Robert. You are not the steward. Give me the keys." Slowly, painfully, he dropped the keys into my palm. The metal was cold. I pocketed them. Then I turned to face them both. I stood on the top step, looking down. "Blackwood Hall is closed," I said. My voice was firm, carrying across the courtyard. "This house is no longer a private residence for people who treat it like a piggy bank. It is now the Blackwood Historical Archive and Museum." "A museum?" Eleanor gasped. "But where will we sleep?" "You won't sleep here," I said. "The bedrooms are going to be storage for the county records. The library is going to be open to the public." I pointed across the courtyard to the carriage house. It stood there small and humble in the shadow of the mansion. Smoke was still curling gently from the chimney where I had left the fire burning this morning. The window boxes were full of winter ivy. It looked warm. It looked alive. "The carriage house is empty," I said. They blinked, confused. "I paid the mortgage on the land myself this morning." I lied. I hadn't yet, but I would. "And I will settle the $12,000 tax lien you ignored. The estate is secure." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single simple silver key, the key to the carriage house. "You can live there," I said, "rent-free for the rest of your lives." My mother looked at the small building. The shed. "You want us to live in the shed?" "It's not a shed," I said sharply. "It is a home. I sanded those floors. I glazed those windows. It is warm. It is dry. And it is more than you offered me." I walked down the steps and pressed the silver key into my mother's hand. I was going to be homeless. I said softly, "You are going to be guests. That is the difference between us." The lesson. My mother looked at the key in her hand. Then she looked at me. Her face crumpled. She didn't argue. She didn't complain about the size or the lack of servants. She simply started to cry. It wasn't the polite theatrical crying she did at funerals. It was deep, ugly, shaking sobs. My father put his arm around her. He looked at the carriage house, the place he had tried to demolish for a parking lot. And then he looked at me. There was shame in his eyes, deep and profound. "Thank you," he choked out. "Don't thank me," I said. "Just take care of it. If I find one scratch on those floorboards, Robert, I will reconsider." They turned and walked slowly across the gravel toward the carriage house. They looked like refugees. They were carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the weight of their regret. I watched them go. I watched them unlock the door. I watched them step inside the sanctuary I had built, seeking shelter from the cold world they had created. I turned back to the main house. I put the heavy brass key into the lock of the great oak door. It turned with a satisfying thud. I pushed the door open and stepped into the grand hall. It was silent. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light coming from the high windows. The portraits of my ancestors looked down from the walls. Beatrice Blackwood seemed to be smiling. I walked to the center of the room and set my satchel down on the table. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I had saved the house. I had saved the history. And in a way, I had saved my parents from themselves. Justice is getting what you deserve. By all rights, they deserved the street. They deserved the cold. But mercy is getting what you need even when you don't deserve it. They needed a roof. They needed a lesson. I gave them both. I looked around at the sturdy stone walls. We were safe now. The stewardship had finally passed to hands that would hold it tight. And if you're listening to this and you're holding on to a grudge that feels like a stone in your pocket, maybe put it down. You don't have to forgive the debt, but you don't have to burn down the house to collect it. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. I closed the heavy door. The latch clicked shut, locking out the wind, locking out the noise, sealing the history inside where it belonged. Fade to silence. What a powerful reminder that sometimes the heaviest blow we can deal is an act of mercy. Have you ever faced a betrayal like Olivia's where family put money above loyalty? Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.